Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Let me describe how we plan to spend this next hour together. I will start by articulating the case for a currency board versus capital controls before introducing our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Steve Hanke. I will then engage into a dialogue with him by asking him a few of my questions. And in the meantime, I would like you to input your questions into the Q&A section by clicking at the bottom of your screen. And I will then direct a selection of your questions to Professor Hanke. Before we start, I would like to welcome our guests who are not live members. We have with us Kurt Schuler from the Centers of Financial Stability in New York. From Lebanon, we have Patrick Mardini, the president of the Lebanese Institute for Market Studies. And I'm particularly thrilled that we have with us today Jacques de la Rosière, whom we all know, of course, to have been Gouverneur de la Banque de France, a distinguished managing director of the IMF, and the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Okay, everyone, ready to get started? Let me start by setting the stage for the current monetary crisis in Lebanon. Lebanon has always imported more than what it exported, with the shortfall coming from the Lebanese expatriates' remittances into their bank accounts in Lebanon. The fixed exchange rate that was put in place after the end of the civil war provided a sense of safety, and the inflows balanced the outflows and even sometimes exceeded them, like in the 2008 financial crisis, when Lebanon became a safe harbor because the Lebanese central banker did not allow the Lebanese banks from investing into the exotic financial instruments. Of course, the reason why Lebanese banks were not allowed to invest outside of Lebanon was to leave them no choice but to invest in Lebanese government debt to finance the chronic budget shortfalls due to a plethora of politically connected public servant jobs, and of course, the huge electricity black hole that made up half of our deficits. This equilibrium was maintained until 2015, when the oil crisis impacted the remittances of the Lebanese expatriates in the Gulf and put pressure on the Lebanese central bank. Instead of confronting that crisis right then, Riyad Salemi instituted the so-called financial engineering, paying over-the-top interest rates to depositors to keep the system going for a few more years. So the incoming own administration in 2016, instead of reducing public expenditures, actually continued increasing them. They increased the public servant salaries and indirectly decimated the financial health of the private school system in Lebanon, because the private school teachers' pay scale is by law linked to the public servants' salaries. And private schools in Lebanon, as we know, educate 2/3 of our students. The system finally collapsed at the end of 2019, with Lebanon going into default with one of the largest debt to GDP ratios in the world. No longer able to borrow, the Lebanese government continued to spend, this time using printed liras that the central bank was printing, causing hyperinflation and a devaluation of the Lebanese pound to dollar exchange rate, with most of our formerly middle-class country falling sadly below the poverty line. Now, since most of the assets of the Lebanese banks were this failed government debt, they no longer had the dollars to meet the deposit request of their clients. And they started drastically limiting the amount of dollars that they would give to their clients. And whatever limited amount they would give, they were using the artificial exchange rate, effectively confiscating half of the amount of the dollars distributed to their depositors. Now, friendly nations led by France are ready to step in with a bailout, but they will not do so unless the Lebanese government implements the structural reforms. And in that, remaining foreign currency reserves are quickly being depleted, in particular with fuel being acquired in Lebanon at the artificial exchange rate at a fraction of the market price, and hundreds of trucks leaving Lebanon on a daily basis to Syria, where that fuel is being sold at the global market price. Now, what are the reforms that the international community wants Lebanon to implement? We all agree on what they are. We should be controlling public expenditures by reforming the electricity sector, by putting in place honest public tenders, by getting control of disputed public payrolls. But these are exactly the things that the corrupt politicians are benefiting from, and that's why they are resisting. We can't even get an audit of the central bank done. The consensus is that all these reforms should be done together and should include the orthodox solution to a monetary crisis, which is to put in place capital controls, to prevent the money from leaving Lebanon and putting further pressure on the exchange rate. But I believe that capital controls would be a major mistake, especially in the case of Lebanon. All of the politically connected money has left Lebanon, and putting capital controls in place today would be like closing the barn doors after the horses have fled. Capital controls would also deter expatriates like us of bringing their money back into Lebanon. And that's particularly important because Lebanon depends on expatriates as the main source of hard currency. So what to do? Well, instead of capital controls, and as a way to break through the logjam of simultaneously doing all of the reforms that the politicians are resisting, Lebanon should jumpstart the reform process by putting in place a currency board, taking advantage of the central bank's gold reserves and the remaining foreign currency reserves to guarantee the full convertibility of the Lebanese pound to the dollar. And this would have the advantage of, in addition, of getting rid of all those artificial and different exchange rates that are making our compatriots' life in Lebanon even more miserable. A currency board does not even need to have a government in place to make that decision. It could be put in place by a vote of the Lebanese parliament in 30 days, and it would immediately and automatically stop further devaluation of the Lebanese pound and halt inflation in its tracks, preventing Lebanon from following the sad course of Venezuela. And since, by law, the central bank would no longer have the right to print liras, this would enforce strict budget discipline, open the door for an IMF program, and hopefully unlock the pledged international support. We are fortunate to have with us today the global expert on global currency boards. Professor Hankey is a professor of applied, let me read a selection of his biography. He's a professor of applied economics and founder and co-director of the Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He is a senior fellow and director of the Troubled Currency Project at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., a senior advisor of the Troubled Currency, a senior advisor at the Renmin University of China's International Monetary Research Institute in Beijing, a special counselor to the Center of Financial Stability in New York, a contributing editor at Central Banking in London, and a contributor to National Review. Professor Henke is also a member of the Charter Council of the Society of Economic Measurement and of Euromoney Country Risk Expert Panel. In the past, he served as a senior economist on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors and as a senior advisor to the Joint Economic Committee of the US Congress. He was an advisor to the presidents of Bulgaria in 1997-2002, Venezuela in 1995-96, and Indonesia in 1998. He played an important role in establishing new currency regimes in Argentina, Estonia, Bulgaria, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Ecuador, Lithuania, and Montenegro. Professor Henke has also held senior appointment in government of many other countries, including Albania, Kazakhstan, the United Arab Emirates, and Yugoslavia. I could go on and on, but that would take the whole hour. So let me stop here and turn to Professor Henke and ask him my first question. Steve, this is the first time in history that Lebanon goes into default and that we are facing such a major financial and monetary crisis. But you have been personally involved in so many crisis situations. For example, you were the advisor to the president of Bulgaria in 1997. You were there. What happened?
Well, thank you, Ray. It's great to be with all of you, especially my friends, Kurt Schuler, Patrick Mardini, and Jacques de la Rosière. I'm delighted they're with us today. Bulgaria happens to be, in my view, the closest thing to Lebanon that we could look at as kind of a case study. So it's very important for people interested in the crisis in Lebanon to get a handle on exactly what happened in Bulgaria, because it's almost identical. In 1990, I was the chief advisor to the Markovic government in Yugoslavia, of course, right across the border from Bulgaria. And the idea there was to try to stabilize the situation in Yugoslavia, because in fact, Yugoslavia at that time was roughly in the same boat that Lebanon is in today. So in being in residence in Belgrade, it's close to Sofia, Bulgaria, and as soon as communism fell, Kurt Schuler and I at that time decided it would be a good idea to write a monograph about currency reform for Bulgaria, and we did. It's called Teeth for the Bulgarian Lev, a currency board solution. That was 1991. And in that book, and as I go through answering this question, Ray, about Bulgaria, I'll try to tie it in to some economic principles and the mechanics, a little bit the mechanics of how you set up one of these currency boards and how the thing actually works, and relate all of this to Lebanon as well as I can. So this 1991 book, it laid out the taxonomy of different kinds of exchange rates. And there are actually three generic types. One is a floating exchange rate, and that's a free market mechanism for balance of payments adjustments. The second system is a fixed rate system, and that's also a free market approach to adjustments for balance of payments. And that fixed rate system includes really only two types. One is a currency board system, and two would be a dollarized system where you don't have a local currency and you're using some kind of foreign currency as legal tender. And the third system is what's called a pegged rate system. And the pegged rate system is not a free market mechanism for balance of payments adjustments. And that, in fact, is what Lebanon has had since the Civil War. They've had a pegged system, not a fixed system. Now, let's go just a step further. What are these differences? Floating exchange rates. They have no exchange rate policy, the monetary authority, no exchange rate policy. The exchange rate floats. They have a monetary policy. The central bank determines the supply of money, base money going into the economy. So the domestic money is all created by the initiative of the central bank. There can be no conflicts between exchange rate policies and monetary policies because you don't have an exchange rate policy. You only have a monetary policy. There can't be balance of payments crises with a floating exchange rate, and there are no exchange controls. So those are the characteristics. Now, fixed. You think, well, fixed, that's strange. You say fixed and floating are both free market mechanisms. Now, the fixed, remember, we're talking about currency boards here, or a dollarized system. You have an exchange rate policy under a fixed exchange rate regime, but you have no monetary policy. Monetary policy is on autopilot. And in that case, you also have no conflicts between monetary policy and exchange rate policy, because with a fixed system, you have a fixed exchange rate policy, but you have no monetary policies, so you can't have a conflict. You have no balance of payments crises, they can't exist, and you have no exchange controls. Now, let's go to this is the important point, and the thing people don't understand about what was existing in Lebanon. You had a pegged exchange rate system. Most emerging market countries have pegged exchange rate systems. They are not automatic setups for adjusting balance of payments. You have an exchange rate policy, the peg. You have a monetary policy also. You have a discretion. A monetary policy can expand or contract at the will of the monetary authority. And you have obviously the potential for conflicts between exchange rate policies and monetary policies. One can be going in one way and one the other way. For example, if the foreign exchange is draining out and going down, and you decide you want to keep the money supply up, you increase the net domestic assets on the balance sheet of the central bank, you goose the money supply, and you've got a conflict. On the one hand, you're losing foreign exchange at the pegged exchange rate, signaling you should be automatically tightening, but the central bank says, no, we don't want to automatically tighten. We want to goose things and keep the money supply growing. So they increase the net domestic assets through neutralization and increase the size of the assets on the balance sheet with these domestic assets to offset the decline in the foreign exchange. So you get a conflict. Speculators know this, by the way, and that's why they blow away these pegs always. That's what happened in Lebanon. At the end of the day, foreign exchange was going down and net domestic assets were being goosed and going up. The speculators could spot the conflict immediately, and of course the system breaks then. And you do have balance of payments crises. They exist. And you usually end up with capital controls. Now, de facto, you do have capital controls in Lebanon. Ray mentioned you can't get your money out of a bank. So you don't have formal countrywide capital controls as we normally view them, but you have the capital controls in effect put on by the banking system itself. So in this 1991 book, Back to Bulgaria, Schuler and I laid these things out. laid out many other things, made the proposal to Bulgaria, and I started making many trips to Bulgaria to sell the idea of a currency board. Now remember, this was 1991, and so the trips kept going, and I practiced what, in fact, Peter Drucker, the famous management guru, told me once, actually, a lunch I had with him in May of 1998, and Drucker told me the repetition principle. And he said, to be an effective salesman, you have to, it involves repetition plus incremental product improvement. And he told me to just keep repeating this currency board story with Schuler one way or another, and eventually we would start selling it. So I did the repetition thing in Bulgaria over and over again. I went, they kept telling me, you know, very, very courteous, polite. I saw all the big political figures, the governor of the central bank, et cetera, and the story was always the same, and that is we don't really have a crisis, Professor Hankey, and so we see what you're doing. You have a nice book there, a blueprint for us, but we have everything under control. Everything is under control. Don't worry about anything. And in the meantime, and this goes to Lebanon, Bulgaria defaulted 2 times on its international debt between 1990 and 1997, which is the date, July 1997, when we actually put in the currency board. So they had 2 international defaults, and they even defaulted on their domestic debt. So 2 international defaults, 1 domestic default. So they're in the same bag as Lebanon, you know, defaulting. Everything is chaotic, disorganized. And at the end of the day, in 1996, a hyperinflation broke out. And you have that in Lebanon. As of July, I determined that Lebanon had entered, it was a 60-second episode of hyperinflation in world history, meaning that, to keep it simple, the monthly inflation rate exceeded 50% per month in July. So technically, Lebanon's hyperinflating. Bulgaria was hyperinflating. Now, in Bulgaria's case, the hyperinflation peaked out in February of 1997. And you can write this down. The monthly inflation rate in Bulgaria was 242% per month. And right now in Lebanon today, I just measured the inflation rate. It's 291% per year, not per month. Bulgaria's was 242 per month, and Lebanon's is 291 per year right now. The monthly rate in Lebanon is 17% per month right now. So that was February of 1997. And that was a month after President Stoyanov had finally seen the light. The repetition principle had worked. The salesman, Hankey, had sold him. He appointed me as his chief advisor, and then we went to work selling the public. And once the president got behind it, the public got wind of it, and the public got completely behind the thing. And immediately there was a knockoff of the Hankey Schuler book. The 1991 book got knocked off, translated into Bulgarian. And believe it or not, it was the best-selling book. This technical thing on currency boards was the best-selling book in Sofia in early 1997. When I would go from the hotel, I wanted to get a copy of the thing in Bulgaria. And so I'd go to the kiosk every morning from the hotel. I'd get up early and go down there. And the guy at the kiosk would always say, "Oh, we've sold out. I don't have any of them left." And so finally I did get a few copies. So Schuler and I have a copy of the thing. But the key here, the public opinion. The public opinion was behind the president. Now the president in Bulgaria has limited powers. They're more ceremonial than anything else, but he has influence. It's the prime minister who runs the government. So we had to convince eventually the prime minister and the parliament, which we essentially did with a little arm twisting and the repetition principle when it went into overdrive. But in July, we put the currency board in. Now, how did we do that? We announced in July, and this is a critical thing for Lebanon. We announced that there was one step here before we put the currency board in that's very important, and that is once the president got behind it, once we convinced the prime minister to get behind it, then the government of Bulgaria proposed to the IMF that they would like to do a currency board as part of the program that they were going to put in place for reform and to get on board with a loan from the IMF. The IMF, of course, was delighted with this because with a currency board, you do put a hard budget in the system, and it makes the IMF's life very easy because all the conditionality is enforced by the currency board. So normally the IMF gives somebody a loan and they have a long list of conditions. You have to do this, that, and the other, balance the budget, and so on, and so do all these reforms. But there's very little incentive for the countries that receive those IMF loans to actually comply with the conditionality. And that's why if you look at the IMF programs, the recidivism is tremendous. These countries right now, we're at, I think, the 23rd program that Argentina has been in with the IMF. I think Pakistan is on the 22nd time around. And all these programs eventually fail because the conditionality really doesn't have sharp teeth. But if you have a currency board, it makes all the conditionality automatically almost happen without any teeth of any kind, because you've got to follow the rules of the currency board, which I'll get into in just 1 minute. But this is important. The IMF got on board with it. We're talking about Bulgaria. If we look at today's IMF, this is important for Lebanon. Kristalina Georgieva is Bulgarian. She is the managing director of the IMF. She knows how this system was set up and how it works in detail in Bulgaria, which leads to, well, how did we set the thing up? We announced on the 1st of July that we were going to install a currency board. We froze the money supply, the monetary base. This is important for Lebanon. We froze the monetary base and we let the Bulgarian lev, the currency, float for 30 days. And we observed what the volume of transactions were in the Bulgarian lev foreign exchange market and what the exchange rates were. And at the end of the 30 days, we had all that market data on what the market thought the fair value of the Bulgarian lev was against the US dollar, against the Deutschmark, and so on. And then we set the exchange rate. So one question with a fixed exchange rate in a currency board system, the question is, well, where do you set the rate? And that is the way to do it. You let the market, in effect, set the rate, and you do that by freezing the monetary base. You take the central bank completely out of the picture for 30 days. It floats, you observe, you make a determination of what you think an appropriate rate would be for the currency board. Now, what is a currency board? It has a fixed exchange rate, but it's a credible fixed exchange rate because the local currency that's being emitted by the currency board is backed 100% with foreign anchor currency reserves. Whatever
the domestic currency is linked to and anchored to, you have to have 100% reserves in that anchor currency to cover the local currency that is being emitted, and exchange and had free convertibility with no restrictions to the
So
anchor
Steve,
currency.
share with us the results of how long did it take to control inflation in Bulgaria? What
Okay, you're getting anxious here and want me to move along. I'm getting my signal from you, right? I was just about ready to get to that point. The key here, by the way, is that the Bulgarian lev, we anchored it and had a fixed exchange with the Deutschmark. So at that point, the Bulgarian lev became a clone of the Deutschmark. It was the same thing as the Deutschmark. If you didn't like your Bulgarian lev, you took it in, you exchanged it for Deutschmarks, and that was a guaranteed thing because we had 100% reserves in Deutschmarks. So it was credible. And what happened? It immediately started bringing down inflation and disciplining the system. The hard budget constraint went in because the Bulgarian National Bank became a currency board and could no longer issue credit to the fiscal authorities. This is the key thing. The fiscal authority, in other words, you put a straitjacket around the monetary authority with the currency board, but that in effect puts a straitjacket around the fiscal authorities because the fiscal authorities can't go to the central bank and get credit. Now, the results that you ask about, as I said, the hyperinflation was 242% a month in February of 1997. We put the currency board in July, and a year later, in July of 1998, the annual inflation rate was 9.5%. And by the end of 1998, December of 1998, the inflation was 1.6% annual. These are annual. So in 1 year, it went from hyperinflating down to 9.5% a year. And in a year and a half, it had gone down to 1.6% per year. Now, the money market rate, the money market interest rates, the nominal interest rates collapsed also, along with inflation, of course. By July of 1998, that's 1 year after we put this in, the money market rate had gone down to 10.5%. And by December, a year and a half after we put this thing in, the money market rate was 2.43%. So what happens, since you make the lev a clone of the Deutschmark, the inflation rate tends to move and converge with the inflation rate in Germany. And that's exactly what happened. Now, in addition to that, and this is critical for Lebanon, this Bulgarian story, the foreign exchange came pouring in to Bulgaria. It went from $864 million at the end of 1996 to $3.1 billion at the end of 1998. That's over a growth of over 3.5 times in the year and a half.
So essentially, depositors came back because they were fully guaranteed their conversion and they could benefit from slightly higher interest rates in Bulgaria than on the Deutschmark.
Yes, exactly. There was a risk-free arbitrage going on. A risk-free arbitrage. You would, even if you were a Bulgarian, you would borrow in Deutschmarks and invest in lev deposits and make the arbitrage. And that's why the interest rate comes down right along with the inflation coming down. In addition to that, Ray, the GDP growth rate at the end of 1996, that's the 6 months before we put the currency board in, the economy was contracting at 8% per year. And in 1998, the first full year after the currency board, the growth rate was 4.3% plus. So you completely turned around GDP growth. The fiscal balance, by the way, at the end of 1996, it was minus 8.1% of GDP. By the end of 1998, the fiscal balance was in a surplus 1.1%. Now, this has worked all these years, over 20 years. The thing is still in place, working perfectly. You've had socialist governments, that's the old Communist Party. You've had a coalition government, you've had a conservative government, and they always more or less balance the budget. And the reason they balance it is the hard budget constraint imposed by the currency board. And right now, out of the 27 countries in the EU, Bulgaria has the second lowest debt to GDP ratio of anybody in the EU. It's only 18.6% of GDP debt. The lowest one, by the way, is Estonia. Estonia had a currency board, which we set up in 1992. That was the first one in the post-Soviet era. And the debt to GDP ratio in Estonia is only 8.4%. That's the best one.
So Steve, this is a fantastic example for Lebanon. It would solve a lot of our problems. But I have a few questions about that. One of them comes from Tamari, who points out that Lebanon has tremendous gold reserves in the USA. Can we use those gold as anchor commodity? And a related question, and since Lebanon is in default, couldn't creditors make claim against those reserves and thus remove the guarantee that makes the currency board work? So that's one question for you.
Okay, so the answer is yes, the reserves could be used. And if you look at the books at the end of October of the central bank in Lebanon, the gold reserves exceed slightly the amount of currency in circulation. So you would have full cover. That's the first point. Now, the second point is those gold reserves, you ask, could creditors put their arm on them and make claims against them? And the answer is, in short, no, because central bank reserves in virtually all cases are immune from claims by creditors. And that's true right across the board. We have in the United States, there's something called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, and the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act lays all this out. But all countries have this.
So what would prevent the government from, after the fact, repealing the currency board and remonetizing debt? Because we've had a fixed exchange rate for forever. What would prevent them from going back to that?
Well, the first thing is that you would want, they could. Number one, they could, but you want to make it very difficult for them to do that. So you would want to make any changes in the currency board law, I would subject those to a supermajority vote of the parliament, at least 66%, maybe even higher than that. If you want to ensure that they can't arbitrarily play some trick on you, you just make the supermajority vote very high. You could make it 80% even. Mm-hmm. So that's one point. The most important point is public opinion, though. Public opinion will be behind, as they are in Bulgaria. They're totally behind the currency board system. About 80% approval of the currency board system in the public. That's why the politicians are very leery about fooling around with the thing. In Ecuador, by the way, which is a dollarized country, which dollarized itself. That's a type of a fixed exchange rate, very a cousin of a currency board, really. They did this in 2001. Then they got a very left-wing president, Rafael Correa, and Correa was in power. He's very much like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, very, very left. he hated the straitjacket of the currency board. He was complaining about it from morning until night. He never got rid of it because he could read the public opinion polls, and he saw that a vast majority of Ecuadorians did not want to lose dollarization. They liked dollarization, straitjacket, and the hard budget constraints. So the public opinion.
We need to make your book. I think it's been translated by Mardini's Institute. We in Arabic. We have to make it a bestseller in Lebanon, I guess, right?
We have to make it a bestseller.
A couple of questions in terms of the vicious circle in which we are right now in Lebanon. The IMF will not step in unless we do the reforms, and that's what's blocking it. Can we really start with the currency board, as you explained, that happened with Bulgaria? Would the IMF look favorably to this system? Would that open the door to the reform rather than wait for a government? And a related question, short of you becoming the advisor of the president of Lebanon, can the parliament pass that law? Can we lobby the parliament to pass that law? Would that be enough to put it in place? In other words, can we jumpstart the system without waiting for the IMF and without the resistance of the?
That's a very critical question, because many economists, by the way, economists tend to confuse things all the time because they tend to be lazy. They don't read primary documents. They just repeat whatever is in the wind and keep the situation confused. And one thing economists assert is that you have a lot of preconditions that have to be met before you can put in a currency board. In other words, the budget has to be balanced. The inflation has to be low. Everything has to be a state of bliss almost. And then they say, oh, if there's a state of bliss, then you can put in a currency board. This is just nonsense. You put in a currency board precisely because you have a crisis. There are no preconditions to putting in a currency board. There were no preconditions in Estonia in 1992 in June when we put the currency board in. You had chaos reigning. The currency in Estonia was the Russian ruble then. They didn't even have their own currency. We put the thing in, and it stabilized things immediately, as it did in Bulgaria, as it did in Bosnia. By the way, there was an international treaty that stopped the Balkan Wars. That was the Dayton-Paris peace agreement, and that had a mandate in it. The peace agreement mandated that Bosnia-Herzegovina would have a currency board for at least its first 6 years of existence. This is in 1997, right after I put in the Bulgarian currency board. I helped put in the Bosnian currency board. They were in a state of war. I mean, this is a civil war. And bang, we put it in, and there were no preconditions, nothing. We couldn't when I went in, Ray, to put this thing in Bosnia and Sarajevo, you couldn't drive a car in. We had a Dutch military plane take us into Sarajevo. They were still shooting. Armored cars were driving around. We put the thing in, and it started working like a charm. With the convertible, the convertible marca was just as good as the Deutschmark.
Amazing. So I understand very clearly, if you put it in place, that will stop inflation very immediately. Now, how do you balance, what balances the balance of payments then? Is it the fact that you have foreign depositors coming back? What technically, that's a question from Nicolas Chicani, who was asking, how does the balance of payment technically balance?
Well, if the initial incentive is exactly like what I mentioned in Bulgaria, you have a huge arbitrage opportunity, and the capital comes rolling in. So you finance the current account deficit, as you said, like in 2008, you had more coming in actually than they were over financing the debt obligations as well, servicing the debt obligations on the current account. So the balance of payments automatically works out. It's arithmetic. It isn't high economic theory. It's just arithmetic. It must balance. There's an identity and it must be balanced with either a floating exchange rate or an absolutely fixed exchange rate.
So do you have any sense of what if we do this, if we freeze for 30 days and then set up the system, do you have any idea what the exchange rate might be today?
Well, it'll be stronger than 8,300 to the dollar. That's my guess. I don't know. But my guess is
the market will decide.
When we did this in Bulgaria, the lev got stronger. The expectations were that the fair value was stronger than the black market had overshot tremendously in the middle of a crisis, and so the lev strengthened. My guess is it would probably strengthen. Where exactly, I don't know.
Yeah, during those 30 days, you said we freeze everything. Right now, the remaining foreign currency reserves are being used to fund subsidies that are creating a black market arbitrage with fuel and other products. So I assume we would have to stop the subsidies immediately, and how do we sell that to the population? I know we're going to run out of funds in a couple of months, but in terms of the public opinion supporting this program, how do you convince them that subsidies this would be better than subsidies?
Well, because the one rationale for the subsidies is inflation. Prices are going up, so prices would be going down. So you'd pull away this big rationale to be subsidizing things artificially. Remy, I've got somebody at the door. Let me take 1 second. Just wait. You can ask your own questions and answer them.
All right. So I think one of the questions that Rami Gisser has asked is, are we by giving up monetary policy, are we weakening ourselves? I would say the answer is that monetary policy in Lebanon has allowed the fiscal policy not to be disciplined. If we put such a system in place, the government will have to balance, and they will, we will have to privatize electricity, we'll have to reduce the number of public servants. Now, I know it would be hard to stop the subsidies, but we only have, based on some of the projections, a couple of months left before we hit the wall. And once we get into hyperinflation, get in Venezuela, it becomes even worse. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of public opinion. But this is, I think, the one way of jumpstarting the reform right now is to push that, especially that it can be done through a vote of parliament. And you don't have to get into the fight of the specific IMF reform one by one.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm back. I have one question. The question about the balance of payments adjustment. You can look at it one of two ways. One way is what I think would happen is the current account would be fully financed by a lot of capital inflows. This is what happened in Bulgaria. You got the arbitrage story and so forth. But let's assume that the capital just dribbled in or didn't come in very fast. What would happen is that the currency board system would automatically tighten up, and the current account deficit would shrink. So that would be the way it would adjust. So either with an expansion, it finances and adjusts, or if there isn't an expansion of inflows, it will automatically adjust by system tightening up.
I have a question from Bassam Yamin which is very interesting. It says, the banking system in Lebanon is effectively bankrupt. So could this currency board work independently of the fact that it's bankrupt? Have you seen a situation in other countries where you had that banking sector in trouble like it is in Lebanon, where you were able to put in place a currency board?
Yeah, this is why I love Bulgaria. It was exactly the same thing. The whole of banks were insolvent. It was almost exactly the same thing. You had lots of trouble in the banking system. That's an exaggeration when I said all the banks were insolvent. That's not true. but there were lots of troubles in the banking system, and the banking system. Let me make 2 points about this with regard to Lebanon, and that is, now we have de facto capital controls being imposed by the banks, and I would say that the one way that the currency board would gain a lot of popularity is if the public understood that those capital controls, with a currency board operating and stabilizing things, stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability. That's why you have to do a currency board first. This sequencing thing is important. You have to get stability before you can fix the banking system, before you can separate the good banks from the bad banks, and even split up within one bank, hive part of it off as a bad bank and keep whatever is good as a good bank. You can't do any of this in the middle of a currency crisis. You cannot do anything. You can't reform electricity. You can't stop subsidies. Nothing will happen without a currency board in Lebanon. People do not understand this in Lebanon. You are in the middle of a currency crisis. So if that's where the epicenter of the problem is, you fix the currency crisis and stabilize things.
So this is really the key lesson here, that we need a currency board immediately to jumpstart the reform system, and the IMF actually would look favorably onto it because it would make their job easier. And from the public opinion, it would be a lot easier to sell a currency board that would bring something positive to them: stability, one exchange rate, no capital controls, rather than get into the fight between the government minister about how to cut and reform electricity or other things. That will come as a consequence. So this is
right. Now,
we should start it.
Absolutely. And now, right back to the banks. Let me make this point, and that is that you've got these poor depositors, they're basically middle and lower class. All the rich people have their money out of Lebanon anyway. I doubt if many have their money tied up in a bank, but at any rate,
only the honest ones kept it in.
Yeah. So what about the currency board and the bank? Fixing the banking system is a separable problem, but it's going to be easier to do with the stability introduced by a currency board and an exchange rate probably that's going to be much more. It'll be stronger, I think, than the current black market free market rate. But at any rate, you will be able, with a currency board, number one, to probably get your deposits out earlier than would be the case if you had a managed floating exchange rate. Because my guess is if you put a managed floating exchange rate in, which is a variety of a pegged exchange rate system, that's what the IMF wants. But the peg, the float, the IMF float, the pound won't float on a sea of tranquility. It'll sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean over time. There's no question about it. That means you will never fix the banking system. You have great difficulty getting your money out. With a currency board, you get your money out more quickly, and you'll probably get it out at closer to par than would be otherwise the case. So you have to think of
the key lessons is essentially sequencing is crucial. You have to jumpstart the reform process by putting in place the currency board up front. And we need to push public opinion. This is why this talk is so important. You have here on Life the International Financial Executive of Lebanon. We all can play a role here in lobbying for this, in putting pressure, in pushing this argument, because this is the one way to break through in a positive way through the logjam we're in.
You summarized it perfectly. And a much more concise way than I would do.
So Professor Hankey, we're at the end of our hour. Let me first thank you. We're grateful for your knowledge, for you having spent so much time analyzing Lebanon, coming up with those solutions. We very much hope that this currency board idea will be put in place. And I think, guys, it's all up to us as a group, LIFE, and all our network to start pushing this concept, put pressure, talk to the parliamentarian, talk to the people in Lebanon. It's a positive thing. We can sell it. We have to make it work because we don't have that much time left. If we continue the subsidies, within a couple of months, we'll run out of foreign currencies. And then if we're out of foreign currencies to guarantee convertibility, it's the end of the road and Lebanon becomes Venezuela. We can still save it. We need to mobilize and move now. Thank you very much, Professor Hankey, for all of your wisdom. And we hope that you will become the advisor to Lebanon and to the IMF in Lebanon. Thank you all.
Ray, thank you, Ray, and a LIFE group. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thank you all for joining us today. And one last point, Professor Hankey has prepared a number of documents that are available for those of you who are interested in learning more. You can send an email to him. I will share his email, and then you can have access to this file if you're interested in getting more information. Thank you again, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
See you.